Welcome, Nick Langley, ClearBridge Investments, to this in-brief for the Inside Network.
Thank you.
We were delighted to host you over at the Investment Leaders Forum in Queenstown. Brilliant atmosphere, so many collaborations, collegiate environment. What did you learn from investment leaders from the advice community? What is it that they can bring to the conversation that helps inspire the work you're doing?
Yeah, what struck me was the extraordinary range of investment needs, and therefore obviously a proliferation of product to kind of try and fill those needs. And that got me thinking about the infrastructure side of it, and in particular, the ability for infrastructure to be, the friend for all seasons, where it sits in the bottom of your portfolio. It's going to do well as the business cycle ticks up. It's also going to protect capital on the downside, and that's really what our strategy is about. So, I was pretty happy with being there in the mix and with something that was going to work for most of the people in the room.
One of the exogenous changes that we're exploring across capital markets is this change in the rate environment. That presumably does things to valuations, particularly for long-term assets. How does that influence your world, Nick?
Yeah, and listen, it's really interesting for infrastructure, right? Because we are utilities on one side and true infrastructure, road, rail, ports, airports on the other side. So the utilities, first of all, are regulated. In the short term, they get to pass through the impacts of inflation. That's been really important the last couple of years. And in the medium term, they get to pass through the impact of higher bond yields. So think of them as shorter duration assets. The infrastructure, on the other hand, has that ability to pass through inflation as well, but not higher bond yields. And so you've got to think of them as longer duration assets. So in these points of rising rates and rising bond yields in particular, you want to really focus on the utility side of your portfolio.
And within infrastructure, it's quite an interesting space. One of the moving parts, as you've touched on, is regulation. That presumably impacts the sort of governments you'd like to work with at a state, federal, international level. How do you think about that in the portfolios you're building?
Yeah, really important. So our basic view is that governments should make policy and regulators should be implementing policy. And so ideally, you want to see a split between the two. Otherwise, you can get some funny kind of outcomes and surprises. And what's important is in the implementation of policy, what sits in the regulator camp, the regulators are actually working quite closely with the government, with the companies to actually develop regulations that will satisfy the policy objectives of government. And so, it's kind of like, conceptual, and then the working group goes to work and actually implements that policy.
You gave a wonderful presentation and ideas around this seismic, societal, unprecedented change and pivot that we're potentially going to go on. That's something that's quite blue sky, innovative, it's quite exciting, but there's also another element to that. Presumably this is quite a challenging time for everyone. What keeps you awake at night when you're thinking about the infrastructure changes we're about to go through?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things, but they break down really to big picture and small picture. So on the big picture side, you're right. We've got north of $100 trillion to spend on this energy transition path to net zero. That is going to squeeze households, right? Either through higher taxes or higher utility bills and cost of living. And so there's going to be a reaction function between pressure on households feeding into political change, which then feeds into policy change, which then policymakers, regulators, feeds into change in regulation for companies. And we don't know what that's going to look like yet. So that's one thing that keeps me up at night, longer term and the big picture. Smaller picture, I'd say physical asset risk is a big one. So climate's changing, more frequent storms, more severe, and we are going to have to make hard choices about saying, well, listen, there are some places where you simply can't live, where you can't build homes. And we've already faced that in New South Wales with flooding and the like. There's similar things going on with wildfires around the world. And that is going to result in some infrastructure being what we term stranded assets, and companies no longer earning a return on those. So, that's quite important to go through asset by asset. And as that's also going to result in a lot of expenditure to fix infrastructure that's been damaged by storms, and that's actually going to slow our energy transition as well. So, that's a kind of a macro and a micro area that we worry about and think about a lot.
You're involved in the meta trend of our lifetime, I think. What would you like the key takeaway to be? The delegates have been able to absorb all of this information. If you were to distill it now so that they can take away and maybe put it into action with their clients over the coming weeks.
Yeah, I think, listen, from my perspective and the presentation that I put forth, what I was trying to say to them is, if you're thinking about an investment in the energy transition space, really the best risk-adjusted return comes from the regulated side, where our companies are working with regulators to implement public policy which says we're going down this path of decarbonising, and that means that you've got reasonable returns for relatively low risk. Coupled with that, infrastructure, because of the regulation and nature of concession contracts, has the ability to pass through changes in macroeconomic variables, and so that means that infrastructure, is that friend for all seasons in your portfolio. As a final point, one thing I said which caused a bit of a stir was that I believe that in 20 years, electricity will be almost free. And that's because we're spending all this money on renewables and so on now. They cost a lot up front, but they don't cost anything to operate. And so once all of that capital's gone in the ground and once we've depreciated a lot of the expenditure on the grids, then actually the cost of electricity is going to come down a lot. That's going to turn things on its head. It'll be inflationary and then disinflationary and, potentially drag on GDP growth for a while and then cause a boost or a boom in GDP growth and productivity. And listen, that's going to turn, the macro world on its head. People are not thinking about that at this point in time.
It's a beautiful conversation. We need to have more of them. Thank you so much, Nick.
That's my pleasure.